home that I had gone to when I was 5, when we first purchased that home, had no feelings in it. There was nothing dark or disturbing about that home. It was small, it was in a bad neighborhood, but it was fine. The home we came to when I was 9 was a home that had been so infested by darkness that it still clung to the walls. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Tia Denise. Today we're going to have some stories. And this story, I think, is far more personal than the last one I told you. It's super personal, and it's personal to me because if this one incident hadn't happened to me, well, I say this one incident, this experience lasted about 4 years. If this experience had not happened to me, I can guarantee you I would not be the person that I am today. Because it had such a profound impact on my understanding of the spiritual realm and of God. This happened to me between the ages of 9 and 12. And some of that time was far worse than others. But I think that if I had to go back and change it, I would most certainly not want to do this again. But I would do it again, knowing what I would gain from the experience. Okay, so here's the story. When I was 9 years old, like 9 and a half, we came back from the mission field. My parents had been missionaries in Papua New Guinea, but my dad wanted to go to seminary and become a pastor. So we came back to the States. Now, the house that we lived in when we came back was this super duper tiny little 2-bedroom house in a very, very rundown neighborhood. We were extremely poor. I cannot overemphasize to you how little we had. But we had actually lived in that house before. So when I was 5 years old, we'd come back from the mission field to do a tour of all the churches who were supporting us and give them an update on what was happening on the mission field. And that's when my parents had initially purchased the house. And it had been a fine situation. I don't remember anything bad about living in that house. Even though it was small and we were poor and it was a bad neighborhood, I was 5 years old at the time. Didn't impact me at all. I don't have any bad memories of that house whatsoever. Had a huge backyard. Loved the backyard. So it was all fine. We went back to New Guinea, and then when we decided to come back, or my parents decided to come back, we moved back into that house. In our absence, we had rented the house out to family friends, people that my family had known for years, and my dad had gone to school with previously, and so they were good family friends. In fact, the wife of that couple had actually been the inspiration for my youngest sister's name. So my family was really close. And so they rented the house out to that couple, and that was that. When we came back to the States, that family had left. We were back to our home. They were done renting from us. We moved back into the house. And I am telling you this much right now. Something had changed in that house. What I then went on to experience from the ages of 9 to 12 was a spiritual oppression like I have never experienced in my life, and I hope never to experience again. But I think what was really difficult was I didn't have the language to express what I was experiencing. Living in this house was so oppressive. And as soon as the sun would go down at night, I remember being overwhelmingly anxious. Like I remember being so afraid, and I didn't know what I was afraid of. I just remember feeling this incredible fear of evil. At the same time that we were living in that house, the Columbine shooting had happened, and it was all over the news. And I remember being very fearful, thinking, what happened to those boys? And could that happen to me? Like, could I just become an evil person? And that feeling just engulfed me. I just remember thinking, everyone says that they never thought that these boys would do this. So what if I just suddenly became evil? And I would say that a spirit of darkness really took hold of that thought in my mind and just plagued me with the idea that I could be an evil person. What's interesting is all of my siblings have said that they felt a real presence of darkness at night when the sun would go down in that house. But I don't know if all of my siblings experienced the sense of oppression that I felt. Like, I remember there would be weeks when I couldn't breathe. And I mean, like, I could not get a deep breath. I felt like my breathing was so shallow. I couldn't breathe. And I just kept, I would sit there and try to concentrate on getting a deep breath and just panicking that I couldn't breathe. And I remember telling my parents about this, but I also couldn't tell them about everything that was happening in my head because I was scared about what was happening in my head. I remember having these intrusive thoughts that were so dark that I didn't even have language for what had just flashed through my head. And I just remember getting really peculiar about things, feeling like I needed to, I remember just doing weird things like I wouldn't sleep on my stomach, although I preferred to sleep on my stomach. I would sleep on my back because I wanted my face facing heaven. I didn't want to sleep on my stomach and face hell. Like things that don't even make understandable sense. But in my young 9-year-old mind, I was trying with all my heart to show that that I belong to God. Like I was working so hard to show God like I'm on your side and to show the devil I'm not on yours. And there was not like any kind of like weird fundamental teaching going on in my house. Like this all sounds so kooky and crazy. And this was a war like I was fighting on my own. I told my parents constantly I was afraid to go to sleep. I was afraid I would die. I was afraid that I didn't believe hard enough in God, that my faith wasn't big enough, that like maybe I didn't totally understand the gospel, you know. And they kept telling me like every night before we went to bed, they would explain like, you know, if you believe or accepted in God's family, like you don't have to work for this. This isn't something you have to work for. You don't have to prove to God you're on his side. He saved you. He chose you. And we went over this every single night. My parents like sang songs over me. We recited scripture together. We learned prayers together. But it didn't matter what they said. I could not escape the darkness. I couldn't escape the overwhelming fear of turning into like this evil person. I couldn't escape this overwhelming fear that I would slip away in the night and die and be taken, you know, by the devil. Again, my parents were not teaching me anything crazy. They had nothing to do with this. And if they had fully comprehended how besieged I was, I feel certain they would have probably taken me somewhere, although maybe not. I don't know that they would, I don't know if they would have taken me to see a pastor. Neither of my parents grew up in like a therapy type setting, so I don't know that they would have thought that that was necessary. But I don't think I was able to convey to them how in mortal dread of darkness I was constantly, but especially as soon as the sun went down. I remember these fears being really bad from 9 and 10, and then 11 and 12, it got a little bit better, and then we moved. As soon as we moved out of that house, I felt like a lightness. I felt like all of these obsessive and intrusive thoughts vanished. I never experienced, to the extent that I'd experienced then, this sense of dread, foreboding. I never experienced this fear that, you know, some claws would get into me and like pull me into this darkness against my will. All of that sense of domination from like a sense of darkness subsided. Now, there was lots of other times that I should have been afraid in life. There should have been plenty of times when I should have had caution about the real world that I was in. Like I said earlier, we lived in this very poor neighborhood. I would say that my mom, having grown up overseas and in a community that was very safe, maybe wasn't as aware as she ought to have been about allowing us to run all over the neighborhood and go into people's houses and things like that. The number of things that could have gone wrong from me just like, you know, running the neighborhood with all the neighborhood kids, going in and out of their houses, going into homes where there was some extreme neglect, violence, abuse going on that just never touched me. I mean, I was walking around in such a bumble of safety, but I was so unaware of how safe I was being kept all the time. And all of these overwhelming thoughts of fear that would happen at night were only ever in my head. There was never anything that happened to me during any of that time period, before or since, that should have ever led me to have such fear. If anything, all that was really happening to me at that time was a complete presence of God. But I have never in my life felt such an absence of the presence of God. I felt it didn't matter how hard I prayed. It didn't matter how much I tried to negotiate with God about how much I loved him. I felt like I couldn't reach him. I felt like no matter what I did, no matter what I said, I couldn't feel peace. It didn't matter what songs my parents sang. It didn't matter what hymns we sang together. It didn't matter what scripture they recited over me. It didn't matter how many times we debated God's love for me and God's desire for me. I could not feel it. I couldn't feel it. And so I never doubted God. I always was doubting myself. Like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I identify with the truth? My parents seemed to get it. None of my siblings seemed to be struggling like I was. What was wrong with me? Although secretly later on, I found out that like they were also having their own fears and struggles at night. So that's what leads me to believe like there was a spirit of oppression in that house, because this wasn't singularly and solely my issue. We just weren't talking about it together. And I think it's because all of us were so like entrenched in our own fear. It's like we didn't even know how to give voice to it. Again, as I stated, when we moved out of that house, all of these feelings of oppression that seemed to be weighing on me so heavily dissipated. I can tell you unequivocally, no time in my life, no matter what has happened, not when my mother died, not during difficulties just in life, in marriage, in jobs, in relationships, never in my whole life have I ever felt so terrified, so scared, so alone and isolated in my fear, ever. I've never felt as depressed and discouraged and frightened the way I felt when I was 9 years old. And I hope I never feel that way again. But see, this is why I'm glad it happened. I learned 3 things during that time period. The first thing I realized is that God does not derive his power from my ability to perceive his presence. He simply does not need me to know or to feel that he's there in order for him to be working in my life and taking care of me. As soon as we left that house, and as I became older, I've never struggled to sense God's love and affection for me. There have been ebbs and flows of my ability to walk closely with him. I have failed on numerous accounts to walk closely with him, though he's never failed me. But I have failed to be close to him. But I've never experienced, like I experienced when I was 9, the sense that I couldn't even feel him. But again, God doesn't derive his power from my ability to feel him. And if I ever walk through a valley of the shadow of death again, I will have learned that my ability to sense his presence has nothing to do with whether he has power over that circumstance or not. I think the second thing I learned was that who I feel like I am and what my circumstances are is not necessarily who I am and what I will always experience. So at the time, I remember thinking, am I just like this problem kid that's just riddled with all these issues? Am I just like, is this who I'll always be? Am I always just going to be afraid and scared all my life? Because previous to that, I had been so carefree. I hadn't a care in the world when we were in New Guinea. That's why this was such a like life-altering, horrifying experience, because I had not ever felt frightened, scared, worried, oppressed. I just didn't fear anything. Just at night, I'd put my head down on the bed and go to sleep. I didn't stay awake for hours and hours and hours with intrusive thoughts and fears and feelings of despair. I was like, who even is this? It's just who I am now. And is this circumstance always going to be like this? When the sun goes down, am I always going to be scared? I remember thinking that so clearly, like, who are these people who enjoy the sunsets? Like when the sun would go down, I would just I remember feeling full body chills of anxiety running up and down, up and down, up and down, just so afraid, but not knowing why. What if I had chosen to believe that I was just a broken person? What if my parents had helped me believe that I was a broken person? What if they had filled my head with all these ideas that, well, you're just going to have depression, you're just going to struggle, you know? What if they had given me an identity of depression? What if they had given me an identity of being broken? What if they had given me an identity of not being a whole person? They didn't give me any language to believe that something was different with me. We talked all the time about spiritual realities and the love of God and his care for me. We talked all about his power and that it wasn't equal to the power of the devil, that the devil only had so much that he could do. We talked all the time. But what they never said to me was, well, you're just, some people are just depressed. Some people are just going to struggle. I think that is true. I think some people, one of the things they always struggle with may be depression. Maybe they will always need that help. But what I think is really something we have to be so careful about with little kids is laying on them a narrative and an identity that they may not yet actually be. Like, don't lay on the identity on a child of being broken or having issues, or just talk to them like they're a person, but don't tell them who they are and what they are as far as what their personality is. Because I perhaps grew out of it, or maybe it's just that we moved. Maybe I'd still be that person today if we still lived in that oppressive house. I don't know. But my parents just never told me that how I was feeling was what I was and who I was. It was just a feeling I was having. So I think what I would say is, don't ever get caught in the idea that what you're feeling or even your physical experience, your physical reality right now is something you're locked into forever. If you are feeling a certain way that you wish you weren't, or if your circumstances are a way that you wish that they weren't, seasons change. It won't always be hard. I mean, it's like Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulations, but be of good cheer because I have overcome the world. And I think that the highs and lows don't need to scare us. What needs to scare us is the belief that this will always be who I am and these will always be my circumstances. Those are paralyzing facts. Because they're not facts, but it's very easy to believe this is who I'll always be. This is a circumstance I'll always find myself in. It won't ever get better. That is a lie. It will. And then the third thing that I feel like was super influential to me and has really helped me as a parent is that thinking back to how my parents dealt with me, they were never, if they were discouraged by my inability to comprehend the wisdom they were giving me, it didn't stop them from giving me the same wisdom the next night. They continually persevered with me. They told me truths. They poured truths over me. They spoke truths over me. We sang. We read scripture. I mean, they were constantly pouring out blessings of truth on me, but I could not receive it. I felt like I had nothing. I felt as hard as a rock. My heart felt so stone cold to everything they were saying. I wanted to believe it. I was desperate to cling to what they were saying, but it felt like holding on to a wave. I mean, I couldn't grasp it. I couldn't get it. And that didn't stop them from continually persevering. But also, I think this is really important too as parents. Just because your kid isn't getting it doesn't mean you're doing a bad job as a parent conveying that information. Be consistent. Stick with it. There are truths my parents told me as I sat by my bedside as I was so scared to fall asleep that I have pulled from to this day that meant nothing to me then, but mean everything to me now. And their consistency and I don't know if it was an inability to seek outside help, or just they didn't believe they needed to seek outside help, or just it didn't even occur to them. They never believed or led me to believe that this was a problem so catastrophic that we had to go out and get outside help because they just threw up their hands. They didn't know what to do with me. I don't know what that would have done to me if my parents had led me to believe that I was such a huge problem they couldn't handle it. Their consistency every night in coming and telling me the same things didn't discourage me. In its own way, it gave me hope because I thought, they're so sure of it. I will get there eventually. I didn't get there eventually. God shed the light for me. I didn't, of my own volition, suddenly understand these things. But their consistency and constantly telling me over and over and over and over again the same truths, and never making me feel like I was such a problem that they couldn't handle me, gave me hope when I felt hopeless. What we found out years later, and I was well into my teens, maybe even in my 20s, was that the family we had rented our home to had major issues. And that the father was hurting the kids. The home that I had gone to when I was 5, when we first purchased that home, had no feelings in it. There was nothing dark or disturbing about that home. It was small, it was in a bad neighborhood, but it was fine. The home we came to when I was 9, after it had been inhabited for 4 or 5 years, by people who were grossly abusing their children, was a home that had been so infested by darkness that it still clung to the walls, that it was dying to get into us. But it couldn't, because while I might not have felt God's presence, his presence was all over me. They never were able to penetrate into me. They never penetrated into my siblings. Our family was not marked by some kind of dark and terrible thing. I believe with all my heart there was a darkness that lived in that house, because I have never experienced anything like that before or since. It was pushing on my siblings as well. But I think what was scarier about that than if we had lived in a house where like doors were slamming and light bulbs were exploding and, things were moving around, that would have almost been better, because then we could have all seen it together and acknowledged it for what it was. As it was, I felt like I was experiencing a world in which I had no language for what was happening in my head. My parents, I knew, didn't get what I was talking about. They didn't know and weren't personally experiencing what I was experiencing. And I couldn't talk to my siblings about it because I didn't know how, and I felt like such a freak. I think it would have been better then if we could have all seen the same things and I hadn't felt so alone, because part of the fear was that I was alone. But would I change that? If I could go back and whitewash my childhood and say, those 2 to 4 years that we lived in that house when I was feeling all those things, what a terrible time. What a scary time for a 9, 10-year-old to be experiencing that. Yeah, I was. But my understanding of God and God's love and the consistency of good parents and the fact that things will get better, those were all lessons I could not have learned outside of that scenario. And those are all lessons I've pulled on. I think that the experience of the things that happened to me in that house were so fundamental to who I am as an adult now. I couldn't be the same person I am now if I had not experienced those lessons. I think it created a depth in me and a trust in God and in his sovereignty and in his plan that I have pulled on over and over and over again. God does not need my acknowledgement of his presence for him to be powerful. And as I look at everything that's going on in the world, and, I think sometimes knowledge and understanding, truly the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a horrible thing to be experiencing. I think the internet is the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, because we are so privy to all the brokenness and all the hurt and all the things that are going on in the world, and all of you can go down 1,000 conspiracy rabbit holes and become so fearful about the world that we live in. Sitting on the brink of what feels like World War III can be so scary. And yet, above all of that is the presence of God. And what I'm experiencing today and what you're experiencing today, and any fears that you have that feel like they're controlling you, God is above all of that. And whether you can feel his presence or not does not negate the power he has and the plan he has and the work that he's doing in your life, in my life, in the life of the entire globe. My little story as a 9-year-old was my story on a planet of 7 billion people. But I was still in God's hands whether I felt it or not. So whether you feel God's presence today or not, he doesn't need you to acknowledge his power and strength and plan for him to have power, strength, and a plan, which he does. And if you are struggling today feeling like, who am I? I never thought I would be this person, or why am I feeling these feelings, or this circumstance, this physical circumstance that I am, like, I hate this, I want out of this, it will get better. Nothing you're living in right now is permanent. And if you are a parent right now that feels like, I am pouring everything I am and have in my kid, they're not getting it. Don't ever believe the lie that you weren't the one that was supposed to parent this child. Don't believe the lie that you're not doing a good job, or that if you tell your child the same thing one more time, they're going to, shut you out because you're not somehow able to give them what they need. You were put in that person's life because you are exactly who they need. Keep being that for them. Don't believe the lie that because you can't see them connect to the wisdom you're giving, that the wisdom is not good wisdom. It is. It just might not be the time for them to connect with it. Keep speaking truth to them, because one day that will mean something to them, whether it means something to them now or not. There's so much in this world that just feels like it's unmanageable, and we don't know how God's working, or sometimes we wonder if he's working at all. But I think that if I could give you just anything to think about, it's that our understanding of what God's doing is not necessary for him to have a plan. My finite mind can't comprehend who God is and what he's doing. I can't comprehend what God's up to. But I am so grateful that he doesn't need my comprehension in order for him to be God. And if there's ever a time when I don't understand what God's doing, and I fall into the idea that his might and power is only valid if I understand the trajectory of his plan, man, I have just slipped and slid into some real foolish thinking. I hope God's mind is bigger than mine. I hope God's plan is more than I could comprehend. So today, when I think back to being a 9-year-old and I think about all that I was experiencing and feeling and the separation that I felt from God and all of that, knowing now that that was all just something I felt, but that wasn't real. I'm so comforted by that, knowing that my 9-year-old mind wasn't the reality that God had to function under in order for him to be effectual. God did not need my 9-year-old mind to approve of his plan in order for him to get done the work he needed done in my life. And I think so many times we have this thing that we do where we think, well, God has to do it my way. I have to understand what God's doing. And if I don't, then that means God's not being God. In all seriousness, be so happy that God doesn't run by the plan that you have directed him to run by. Be so happy you don't understand what it is that God's doing, because he has a ability and a strength and a power and a comprehension so far above yours and so far above mine that if we limited him to what we expected he ought to do, or we limited his power to what we could comprehend, what a hell we would live in. I don't know where God's going and what he's doing and the plan that he has over the earth right now. It does feel like every time I turn on the news, there's a horrible story, and there's plenty of reason to be afraid, and there's plenty of reason to feel scared and upset and confused about the state of the world. And yet, thank you, Lord, that I had the experience I did as a 9-year-old, because I learned then I don't need to know what's happening for it all to be okay in the end. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. We'll get back to our usual content. Thank you guys for giving me this outlet to talk about deeper and greater things on Wednesdays. I love Wednesdays. Even though this is only our second Wednesday, I love this kind of stuff. So I hope you guys do too. And we'll talk again soon. On Friday, we'll be back to our lighter fare. So I'll see you guys then. Bye.